on today's StoryBeat.
I like to say to students who want to get into this that one of the things I've learned really hard is that every interview is an exchange of energy. And what you put out, you're going to get back. You know, it is definitely this exchange. And I said, if you watch the nightly news, you can always tell if the reporter is interested in this or not just by the energy of the response.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, the highly popular documentary filmmaker Rick Sebak, is a native Pittsburgher who's worked at Pittsburgh's PBS station, WQED, since 1987. Rick's created dozens of local TV documentaries known collectively as the Pittsburgh History Series, including Kennywood Memories, What Makes Pittsburgh Pittsburgh, and Right Beside the River, as well as many more. He's also produced 15 national programs for PBS, including a hot dog program, a flea market documentary, and a few good pie places. I've seen a number of Rick's documentaries and have always been delighted by the way they're put together, and especially by the uplifting, wonderfully human stories Rick's work delivers every time. Rick has been honored with several regional Emmy Awards and 2 national Emmy nominations. One Pittsburgh bar named a drink after him. In 2018, Pittsburgh Magazine named Rick one of the 50 greatest Pittsburghers of all time. There's even a street named for him in Pittsburgh's Somerset at Frick Park neighborhood. So for all those reasons and many more, I am deeply honored to have the extraordinary filmmaker, one of Pittsburgh's absolute favorites, Rick Sebak, join me today. Rick, welcome to StoryBeat.
Thank you, Steve, very much. And that's enough.
That's enough of that. So let's go back in time a little bit. I'm going to ask you a question I know you've asked more than once in your career.
Okay.
When did you first get interested in this thing called show business, filmmaking, documentaries? When did this start for you?
Probably at different times. Growing up, my mom was one of the founding members of Stage 62, the community theater group at that point in Bethel Park. They're now in Carnegie, Pennsylvania.
Right.
But she helped found that. And we, of course, tagged along. I ran the hat check service, I remember, at many productions at Bethel Park Junior High, which isn't there anymore. And that sort of got me interested in this whole world of theater and everything. I was very lucky in high school. We had a group of kids that were all interested, and we had a great teacher, Paul Moshnick, who started a theater group there at Bethel Park High School called Theater 400. It was in room 400. And we did some amazing things in high school as a group of kids who were just all interested in this. So I sort of took that with me when I went away to school. I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I don't know why, but I always thought I'd be a double major in English and maybe theater. And I think that's what I started as. But
Well, the English shows up in your work brilliantly because the way that you write and the way that you present is wonderfully drawn, like as if we're listening to a book.
well, thank you. No, as a theater student, the first semester, I think, at Chapel Hill, I had to be talent for a Saturday morning project that was done by students in the television department. We would go to Raleigh, North Carolina, not far from Chapel Hill, and be newscasters or people in a little dramatic production or whatever. We were just sort of fodder for the television students. And I thought the guy that was teaching that, Paul Nichol, was just great.
Mm-hmm.
I said, I want to take classes with him. And they said, well, in order to take his class, you have to be a major in television or in the department, which is now called communications, but then it was called RTVMP, radio, television, motion pictures.
Okay.
So I switched from being a double major in English and theater to English and RTVMP. And that sort of got me thinking about television. And I don't know why. I think for my initial things, it was the beginning of Sesame Street in the early 70s. And I thought I could get into children's television. And
Well, you grew up here in Pittsburgh, so you must have known about Mr. Rogers at that point.
I did know about Mr. Rogers, but I'm sort of not the right age to hit any of Fred's milestones head on.
Right.
What I remembered was Josie Carey, who was his partner.
I remember Josie Carey.
Josie Carey and Fred Rogers produced the first program here at WQED, and that was called Children's Corner. And they took it to NBC for a while. It was a huge hit there. They won all kinds of national awards in the 50s. And while I was at school and I sort of made known this interest in television, my mother saw an article in the Pittsburgh Press, that's not there anymore, and it was
Indeed.
just one line that said, Josie Carey is doing a children's soap opera in South Carolina. And my mother sort of said, hey, you should send her a letter. So I did. I typed her a letter and, explained that I remembered her from television in Pittsburgh. And so she responded and said, why don't you come down on your spring break? We'd like to meet you. And that's sort of what got me into public television. She was doing a children's program called WHEE, WHEEE exclamation point. And there was a children's soap opera as part of that, which was brilliant, called Bertha Beetle's Boarding House for Bugs.
Bertha Beetle's Boarding House for Bugs?
It was set in a big like tomato soup can, and Bertha Beetle ran a boarding house for bugs, and it was the day-to-day true life story of a lonely little ladybug and how she manages a. And the thing was, when you saw it on television, you thought they were all bug-sized, and then I remember when I got to the studio, and I mean all these things were pretty big because they had to have puppets and people manipulating them and everything. Even though you perceived it as very small, it was big, and that was just a joy. And I worked with Josie for the summer, and she said, just stay with us. And I had already set up to go do my junior year abroad in France, and it just seemed to be too much to give up at that point. So I went away to France for a year, and then she had me back when I came back. And so I kept up a relationship with South Carolina ETV. When I graduated from college, something came up. I was desperately looking for a full-time job, and they contacted me and said, hey, we need a production assistant on a film we're making about energy conservation. And I went and I stayed 11 years.
So that was your first taste of documentary filmmaking then?
In my post-college career, I've only had 2 jobs, both in public television. For 11 years at South Carolina ETV.
Mm-hmm.
ETV means educational television. And then I've been here at WQED now for 37 years.
Is that all?
Coming up on 38.
I think that's just extraordinary. What is it about WQED that's special? Why have you stayed there all this time?
Because I still love what I get to do.
Mm-hmm.
I love the fact that I get to, celebrate things and learn about things. I say the thing that I love most about Pittsburgh, I think, is that it's perpetually surprising. And I think a lot of that has to do with history. I think as the 19th century became the 20th century, we were a world capital. The richest men in the world lived here. Oil is first pumped from the ground in Titusville, 100 miles north of here. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. But, aluminum is first made in a usable quantity at a usable price here in Pittsburgh. And then, of course, there's steel and glass and all these things. And, I can remember finding out, too, that our really first business is fur.
Fur.
Fort Pitt, there was fur trade. That's what, everybody was into at the time. And it was really, one of our very first, if not the first, money-making enterprise here in Pittsburgh.
And it helps, I assume, that we're very much a melting pot from all over the world.
Yeah. I mean, and I think still, and that's, a beauty of all of this. I think, we're reminded a lot that we are all immigrants.
That's true.
My name is Sebak, which is Slovak, but my father's mother was German, and my mother was all Irish. So I'm sort of Heinz 57, as I think many of us are.
You're a bit of a Pittsburgh mutt like the rest of us.
Exactly.
So you generally build your stories not only around locations or businesses that are of interest, but you build them around the various folks that work in it, because that's what's most interesting is the people. And rarely do you focus on anyone who is well known or a celebrity. I loved your episode on Mr. Rogers. I thought that was fantastic. but you mostly, it's on common people, the everyday people. What led you to focus on that world rather than to go after celebrities or more well-known folks?
Well, I think part of it is just that, it's nice to surprise people just as I like being surprised. And, people who are on TV a lot get used to it. And I always think there's a freshness and unexpected quality that comes from talking to people that aren't on TV all the time. And
Hmm.
I did not set out with that goal, but I realize now that if you look at all of my programs, local and national, they are celebrations of small family owned businesses.
For sure.
Part of that is just the family and, people who are in it. And when a family owned business survives a generation, it's really an incredible feat. And, 2 or 3 generations is amazing.
That's for sure.
So we love to celebrate that. So,
Most businesses don't survive a few years, let alone generations.
right, exactly.
So, what then attracted you to documentaries in the first place? Was it working at SEETV? Was that what brought you to like this form and to go after it?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I remember there was one documentary that I saw about food in New Orleans that was on public television. And I thought, like, wow, I would love to do stuff like that. Um, my actual path, I started as a writer at South Carolina ETV, writing scripts. And we served as a sort of a advertising agency for state agencies. The public television system in South Carolina is a state agency, and we work, with the government. And at the same time, because of a girl I knew in college who started to work for Doubleday, I got on Doubleday Publishing House's reviewers list. I'd done a lot of writing for the Daily Tar Heel in Chapel Hill. And she called me and said, I'm supposed to get new people on the reviewers list. Can I put your name down? I said, sure. And I would get a big box of books every week from Doubleday. And then I thought I should be doing something with these. And I know that they had a book review page in the Sunday paper there in Columbia, South Carolina. And I called the editor and I said, I did some book reviews for the Daily Tar Heel in Chapel Hill. He said, why don't you come by and I'd like to meet you. And I went by and he was a great guy. And he said, take 3 books from my shelf, bring me 1 review. You get to keep 3 books. And then, if I publish your review, I'll give you $20 more. And that just became a regular thing. And that led to someone at my station saying to me, Beryl Dakers was her name, and she produced the arts program. And she said, well, why don't you come on my show and read your book reviews like Gene Shalit does on the Today Show?
Right.
And I said, oh, that's kind of interesting. It's not a lot of work because I've already done the work. And so we started that. And I just did it for, I'm going to say, maybe a month or two before the guy that had the nightly show called Carolina Journal said, I like those things you do for Beryl. Why don't you come on my show? You'll get a bigger audience. And so Tom Fowler convinced me to make the jump from Art's the Thing to Carolina Journal. And then I think I did 1 or 2 reviews there. And he said, you ride your bike to work every day. Why don't you do a story about riding your bike to work? And I don't think I never did another review. I started doing these little mini documentaries. And that sort of convinced me that this is a world I really loved.
Do you think of yourself as primarily a writer then?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Because you're writing these documentaries in a way. They're visual, clearly, and there's audio, clearly, but you also are narrating in large parts of them as a sort of the outside narrator watching what's going on to the chorus that you're focusing on. It feels to me like you are actually in your heart of hearts a writer who is creating stories around the real world.
I like that. And, it's kind of flattering. I do try to be careful about, when do I interrupt the flow of the story?
Exactly.
I've always loved the fact that I think in traditional documentaries, there isn't always a narrator. Sometimes you can do it without a narrator. And I think that I used to call that the Nanook of the North syndrome because there's no narrator. You just see what's going on. And just for the sake of time, you can often make it go faster if you add a little narration.
Okay, so explain for the listeners what that means, that you would add a little narration that helps the story move quickly.
Right, because when you interview people, sometimes they give you too much material.
Mhm.
And usually that's, we use a very small point. In fact, I always try to tell people in an interview, What you will say when you see this is, "That's all he used?" We have more material than we can possibly use, and so sometimes I will condense or just try to jump over a bit of history, without going into all the details and all of that. Although I'm always fascinated, to find out things. So,
Well, that's clearly evident in your work, is that you are fascinated by what people do and who they are. And if that was not a sincere part of who you are, and you and I've never met, so I don't really know you other than from your work, but it's evident you couldn't do, I don't think, what you do without being sincerely interested in humans. Is that accurate?
yep, I think that's a basic.
Uh, but I think there are a lot of people in show business or in movie making or in documentary filmmaking that really aren't that keenly interested in people. They're interested in subjects of one kind or another.
That's true, and also, I'm so aware that social media has made on-screen narrators' presence so much more common, and I don't know that it's always a good thing. I'm rarely in my shows. Occasionally, I'll do an intro or something like that, but when it comes to the actual story, you usually don't see me.
But we hear you and your presence. You have an extraordinary, very memorable delivery. And all you have to do is turn your TV on or your computer and search YouTube and look for Rick Sebak. And I don't have to see you at all. I know it's you. You have a distinct voice.
Yeah, but I don't think it's an announcer voice. I think it's,
It's not an announcer. No, it's very folksy. You're a folksy narrator, which is very warm and welcoming.
yeah, I always remember back when Jerry's Used Records was in Oakland, here in Pittsburgh. I did a story, I think, for Things That Aren't There Anymore, mostly to talk to those guys who hung out in Oakland and grew up in Oakland, to talk to them about Forbes Field. But there was Dewey Garral, and he worked there at Jerry's Used Records, and I interviewed him as well. And after the show aired, he said that he watched it with his grandmother, and she said, "Who is this guy that's talking? It sounds like he knows me." And I said, "That's the nicest compliment I could get."
That's beautiful because you feel like you're just the guy who lives next door. It doesn't feel like you're above the listener. And that's, I think, really what's makes the hallmark of your shows. Did you arrive at that? Is that just you, or did you actually think about how you were doing that?
No, I don't think it's a planned or calculated thing at all. It's just seems to be the best way to tell a story. I think that's what always trying to find. And I mean, even to this day, we've been working on a story right now about the Bottle Rocket Social Hall in the neighborhood of Allentown here in Pittsburgh.
Sure.
The neighborhood, I said, that's the way I begin. I was saying, this is confusing. There's a city in eastern Pennsylvania called Allentown, but there's also a neighborhood above the Liberty Tubes called Allentown, spelled exactly the same way. And, I have to listen to all the interviews that we do. And I say, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. How do I put all these pieces together? Let people talk as much as I can without me interrupting, but I also like the style of CBS Sunday Morning and also 60 Minutes, where, you don't always see a lower third key that tells the person's name and all of that. I try to introduce everybody. So in that way, I'm a little bit of a narrator who talks a little bit too much just to get all those names in and to introduce all the people. So I try.
But it never feels too much. It always feels just right.
Well, good. Thank you.
So, one of the things that I noted, and I think it's fascinating because I have the same issue here with just doing StoryBeat, which is you have had to pronounce the names of hundreds and hundreds of people and different places. And many of Pittsburgh's neighborhoods, people, and so on are ethnic and they have odd pronunciations. How do you get the pronunciations right and so clearly? Do you practice?
Sometimes, sometimes it's an extra phone call. That's funny. I always remember I did a couple of things. I don't. I'm trying to think. I don't know if it's ever in a show, but at some point I told the story of Charles Dickens coming to Pittsburgh. I want to say it's 1842 or 1843. Charles Dickens comes to Pittsburgh on an American tour with his wife. They got on a steamboat here in Pittsburgh, and it was really the reason why he came to America. He had sort of been taken by a scam about the town of Cairo, Illinois. And I said, well, is it Cairo? Cairo? How do they say it? And I remember, like, we're gonna have to figure this out. And so I called. I looked it up. I looked up the number for Cairo City Hall, and the woman answered the phone and said Cairo. And I said, "Thank you." Yeah, I mean, I do want to pronounce things correctly, and actually, I'm always surprised at some of the things I see online where people are doing stories about Pittsburgh. I saw one today where the guy could not pronounce Carnegie the way we pronounce Carnegie.
Right.
Called it Carnegie. And, we don't say Carnegie here. We say Carnegie,
Well, that's because everybody knows Carnegie Hall in New York.
New York. But here we say Carnegie.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
apparently that's the way he said it. And so, I always think that's interesting. But often you'll see people that come to town say Promontes as well, instead of Permanis, the way we say it here in Pittsburgh. And I think that's always important to try and get it the way people there say it.
Well, and that's what I was curious about is you actually work at that. It doesn't come naturally, does it?
No, it doesn't at all. And, actually, there was one just recently I remember, and I'm not going to remember the name of the town, but it didn't even look like what you were trying to say. But I was doing a thing for the Engineers Society here in Pittsburgh, and there had been some work on a river, and I thought I pronounced the river correctly, but I wasn't even close. So,
And then that then becomes again a part and parcel of what you do, which is to get not just the story right, but the people right. And that's what makes it so fascinating is that the people are the stars of your show. And like I said earlier, almost none of them are famous in any way, shape, or form, but they're your stars. And that's what makes it so fascinating, combined with these very interesting neighborhoods and family relations. Let's talk for a moment about actually what you do as a director, producer, writer, etc. What makes a documentary as opposed to a narratively structured fiction work?
Truth? I don't
Truth.
know. Yeah, I'm never making things up. I'm just, I guess it's a kind of reporting, but just paying attention to the facts and trying to get everything correct. I always amazed by magazines and stuff that have fact checkers. We don't have a fact checker here. I have to rely on myself to do that. But I'm trying to be very careful.
Well, but you have control over the editorial process, I assume.
Right.
And so you could, if you chose to, and I don't think you do, but you could choose to make things look differently than they are.
Maybe, yeah.
You could slant stories in ways that would be different than what you actually shot just by the way you cut them. But that's not the impression that I get off of what you do. You're trying to present some kind of centered truth about what it is you're focused on.
Exactly right. And sometimes people will ask me, like, you must have lots of outtakes and like funny things that people said and stuff. And I said, if we ever get that, we try to include it. We don't have a great storehouse of funny things that people said. We try to include them, try to make room somehow that we can hear the funny comment or the misunderstood question or whatever.
Well, the world, or in most cases, Pittsburgh is your oyster. And so you can pick from an infinite variety of places and stories in a city like ours. Are there special places you turn to for ideas?
No.
No.
No, I think it's just it's sort of a gut thing, just trusting my own instincts. What do I like? What do I think could make a story? And there are no rules. It could be a person who interests me, or it could be a place, a business, whatever. It's not easy to say how we decide what we're going to do next.
Is always uniquely different for every project, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it's, I try to trust myself and see what happens. And I've been very lucky.
You have very common man tastes, and that's what shows up, I think.
Could be. Yeah. I remember for PBS, when we did a national show, we always do two at once to take advantage of the travel. And if you have two different topics, you can, find a city that has this and this. And so, like, when we did a hot dog program, we did great old amusement parks at the same time. I can remember the crew that traveled with me. They said, no one's ever going to watch this hot dog program. Everyone will watch a great old amusement parks program. It turned out to be the other way around, but it was just expectations. But I knew how much I loved hot dogs, and let it go at that.
So once you have decided on an idea, you have decided we're going to do a show about hot dogs, and people are telling you, no, that's not going to work. What, as a director, what are the first steps you do? Is it research? Is it figuring your travel plans? Is it gathering equipment? What are the things that a director does in a documentary?
Well, it's funny. I never take the title director. I'm a producer. Usually the director credit goes to my camera person
Okay, good.
because I don't touch the camera. I mean, rarely do I touch the camera. It's very much a collaborative thing, and that's one of the things I love about it, is that there's someone else capturing things. And then often there's a third person, the editor, who is not connected to what we experienced, just looking at what exists in terms of the record we created on video and how it might go together. So it's a weird process, but I like it very much. And I like the fact that there are different people involved.
Well, so that's what I'm interested in, is the weird process. Where do you start? Do you get books? Do you go online? Where do you start?
Yes, to all those things. Yes, I love the research part of it. And it's changed over the years. Obviously, the internet came along and made some forms of research much, much easier. I remember that when we did a hot dog program, there were various search engines. Google hadn't arrived yet to take over. And I worked with a woman named Nancy Jean Coates, who we sort of competed. She was my associate producer, and we competed to see where we could find hot dog places that might be potentials. And I remember her glee at saying, she said, I found a guy that has a website, which was rare at the time. He had a website for his push cart selling hot dogs in Alaska.
What year was this?
It would have been 97. And she was just so thrilled. And I said, and then our finance guy, the grants that we would get from PBS were reimbursement grants. You had to spend the money to get the money. And he came and said, you guys haven't spent enough money yet. You need to do another shoot. And it was winter time. And, I said, oh, well, maybe we can go to Florida. Maybe we could go to New Orleans because there's that novel about the guy that pushes a big hot dog cart. Anyway, she said, what about the guy in Anchorage? And I said, he's not going to sell hot dogs in the winter. And she said, just let me send him an email. And so she sent him an email, and he said, I sell hot dogs one day, which is the day of the Iditarod dog sled race. And I just said, oh my God, that is so perfect. Hot dogs, cold dogs, and so that became our story. And it was just excellent. Totally not planned or anything. And one of our questions is, why do you have a website for your push cart? And the answer was, my roommate makes websites and he wanted to have this for his, portfolio. And so it was just our luck to stumble on this guy that had a website for his push cart in Anchorage.
But this is almost 30 years ago, and there weren't that many websites. Today, everybody has a website.
Right. And thank goodness that Nancy Jean found it on a, search engine.
So you get an idea, but you may not have an end goal as to what you think the product will be.
A TV program.
Well, it's a program, but you don't know. You can't script it out. You can maybe get an idea of where you want to go and who you want to talk to, but you can't script it in advance. Am I correct?
Oh, right. No. It's all the writing comes after we go out and shoot and gather interviews and footage and find what we like and what we don't like and all that kind of stuff.
And the edit is your final right.
Yes. And, which part of this process, I don't know which one I like the most. I love the research. I love going out and shooting and, talking to people and gathering. And I also love the editing.
I'm going to guess, like many people who do what you do, who I actually have spoken to a number of them, you would prefer to keep doing these different things because that's what keeps it fresh.
Yes, I think that it's always, the variety of what I get to do is one of the things that sustains me. It's just really,
Because when you're in the field, you're loving that. And then when you're back in the edit bay, you're loving that. And then when you're prepping for a new show, you're loving that. You're constantly rolling in things that keep your mind very occupied.
Right. I mean, just recently I saw a thing. I think USA Today still does those 10 best lists, and they did like 10 best places to spend Easter. And I want to say Pittsburgh was number 2.
Mm.
I thought like, wow, that's interesting.
Sometimes we're the number one place to live.
Exactly. But this was because we were number 1 in the amount of chocolate and candy stores per capita.
I didn't know
And I
that.
thought, oh, that's interesting. I did one story about Betsy Ann chocolates up in Westview, but I know that there's lots of others. And I thought that could make an interesting show, chocolates. And I swear, anytime I mentioned it to someone, they said, oh, do you know about this one? And everybody's got a favorite that's in their neighborhood or in their part of the town and stuff like that. And so we're lucky that way. And so I may try to do that next.
All right, so I'm going to ask you a question I ask lots of guests, and I'm always fascinated by the answers. What for you makes a good story good?
Unexpected responses or cleverly stated responses. I just love that. And I can think of the thing that we're working on now about this bar up in Allentown, Bottle Rocket. Chris Copen, the guy that owns it, said, it's kind of like a dive bar as if it were run by the Muppets. And I just thought, like, wow, that is just great.
A dive bar run by the Muppets.
That's their sort of philosophy, and that's what makes them so lovable. So that's kind of cool.
How often do you get deeply into it? You've got your footage, you're starting to work on it, and you find it's not at all what you thought it was. It's something totally different. Does that ever happen?
Occasionally, I mean, and it depends on whether we're doing, one story in a collection of similar stories or whether we're just doing a standalone story, which we've been doing a lot of recently. Then I don't want, there to be any sort of slips. I want to make sure that before we start to edit, we have enough stuff to do it.
What would you say is the average amount of footage you need to the length of show that you have? Is there a standard to it?
No.
No.
That's funny. That reminds me, the first time I made a documentary in South Carolina, the video equipment, portable video equipment was new, and it was all booked. And I asked if we could do a documentary about the state dance of South Carolina. And the head of the production department said, yes, you can do it if you do it on film, which was the older technology. He said, but I wanted you to keep your ratio of footage to finished footage at 10-1. So, when I came here to QED, they were still doing National Geographic specials here. And I think their ratio was like 500-1.
Wow.
Because they were a lot of nature photography, and that eats up a lot of film, and they were all shot on film. But so this was a regulation he gave, 10-1 would be your ratio. And, so you have to be kind of like succinct in your interviews and all of that. And, but my cameraman and I worked out a system of he would stop rolling after we did the first question or two. And then if I heard something that we would record the audio for the whole interview. But then if I heard something, I would say, let me ask you that question again. And then that would be a signal to him to roll. And then we would get the response that we wanted to hear again on film as well. So,
but you did that so that the interviewee didn't realize that you'd missed it,
right? Or that we turned the camera off,
or you turned the camera.
You don't want to diss or make the interviewer seem like it's less than important.
So one of the things that happens in this show for me is trying to figure out the best questions to ask. You ask a lot of good questions. I particularly enjoyed the show What Makes Pittsburgh Pittsburgh, because that was the main question that you asked everybody. What makes Pittsburgh Pittsburgh? And then you got all these various answers. How do you come up with your questions? How do you decide what to ask people?
Oh, I'm not sure. Sort of like, the topic or whatever. I mean, a lot of it, and it is, if you have to put together a proposal to try and raise some funds, that forces you to, come up with a theme like that. When we were doing, I did a series of programs called It's Pittsburgh and a lot of other stuff. And I don't know why, near the beginning of that, I just started to ask people, well, why do you live here? And then that became its own show. Why do I live in Pittsburgh? And I mean, I thought some of the answers were great. I always remember one, a woman who was a professor of engineering at CMU, and she said, it's this weird texture. She said, I've lived in several cities around the world, and, here there is such a depth of family and a depth of culture and all of that. She said, it makes it very unusual and a really interesting place to live.
Well, you'll know as well as I do that for a very long time, Pittsburgh was a sort of a joke name. It would get used in sitcoms and so on as a joke city because we were a dirty, smoggy, rough and tumble place. But over time, it's become this jewel. And that's what I find fascinating because you can go and look at your old shows and see some of that rough and tumble still there. And you can see the more modern shows and see how much of a gem the city has become.
Right. I said, we have a show called Things That Are Still Here, and many of them are not still here.
They're right. But that's how Pittsburghers describe how to get from one place to the other is you go down to that corner where that store used to be. And so how are you supposed to find where you're supposed to go?
Where the eyes used to be.
One thing that I love about your work is that you are an empathetic interviewer. Do you consciously work toward being empathetic toward the interviewees?
Yeah, probably, because I'm not out to fry anybody. I'm not 60 Minutes. I'm not, there to do any sort of groundbreaking investigative reporting. I'm generally there to celebrate. And sometimes if I'm asked to speak to a class or something, I like to say to students who want to get into this that one of the things I've learned really hard is that every interview is an exchange of energy. And what you put out, you're going to get back. And I'm sort of blessed with a face that looks like I'm smiling all the time. And that helps. I try to be engaged. I also learned early on, you don't want to talk a lot. You want to stop talking so that you have a clean response. But, it is definitely this exchange. And I said, if you watch the nightly news, you can always tell if the reporter is interested in this or not just by the energy of the response. And so I try to keep things up. I remember too, I'm going to mention the hot dog program again. A guy called me and he said, I work in computers. And he said, but I just saw your hot dog program. And he goes, I think I'm going to quit this and open a hot dog place. These people all look so happy what they get to do. And I said, well, I'll just warn you, they may look happy because I'm happy. And, that's them responding to my level of happiness that I get to go around the country and talk to people about hot dog places.
I think it's impossible to believe that anyone could spend years and years and years in a hot dog place and always be happy.
Right. No, it'd be impossible.
Impossible. So we talked earlier about, the insertion of your narrative voice throughout the shows. Do you have a process that you go through to decide I'm going to talk here? Is it just simply you're trying to fill a blank where you need to bridge something, where you need to explain a backstory? Is that what it is? Is it always based on that?
Yeah, I think it's always a degree of necessity. But as I said earlier, I usually work with an editor, and I have no problems with the editor saying, I don't think you need to be here. We can just go from this to this. And I appreciate that. The less of me, the better. Yeah, but it's usually a matter of either introducing a person or just trying to get through a segment a little bit quicker and condensing down some of the stuff we've learned.
I kind of think of your voice as the spice that makes the whole work.
Well, that's very kind of you, but, I don't know that I always think that.
Well, what do you think? Do you think you should get less of you all the time?
Yeah, I mean, no, because I do that thing where I introduce people, I'm not eliminating myself. But yeah, I did some things in South Carolina that had no narration. And that was, experimenting. I did a documentary about correctional officers, prison guards. It was a request from the corrections department because they had a high turnover. And they thought the high turnover was the result of people coming to get a job as a prison guard thinking it might be easy. And they wanted to emphasize that, it's not an easy job. And I can remember we were working on it. We had gone to a couple of different levels of prisons already. And waking up one morning and I had NPR on, and they said prison break or prison riot in South Carolina. And I thought, like, what? And there was a disturbance in one of the maximum security prisons there in Columbia, South Carolina.
Oh my.
And then we went and talked to those guys, and you realized, whoa, this is really hard. And I can remember one of them saying to me, one of the prisoners was hiding him. And he said, I took off my uniform, I put on a T-shirt, and he said, and he just said, stay in my cell. And he said, and I sat there, and he said, I looked out the window, and I thought, this is a terrible place to die. And I thought, whoa.
Oh.
You
Did
know?
that make it into the
Oh,
your show?
yeah. Oh, for sure.
Yeah, that's it's interesting because most of your shows are not that dramatic.
No, they're not that dramatic. And also, but the reason I brought that show up was there was no narration. It was just guards talking about how hard the job was, which was our goal. It didn't matter what their names were. That's a way to do it, and it depends on what you're trying to do. But as I said, there are no rules.
Well, I think that makes it also fun for you because you can continually be creative without having to fit into a mold.
I hope so. Yes.
But in the same light, you then also work for people. Yes. Are you completely independent? Do you self-finance?
No. I'm a full-time employee at WQED.
Okay, so my question then is, you then have, let's call them bosses. You have people above you who say, I assume they say yes or no to various projects. That not every single project you've ever offered up as a thought was accepted, that there have been rejections along the way. And when you're making a project, you also will get, I'm going to assume, again, you correct me if I'm wrong, somebody's going to come and give you notes as to what, yes, no, we won't accept this, we love that, more of this. Do you get those kinds of notes?
Yeah, occasionally. I because I've been doing shorter stories, I can't think of any instances like that recently. But I mean, there have been times. I mean, especially when you turn in a proposal, often there are changes to be made and all of that. And I can remember when we were first started to talk about doing a show about pies with PBS. It started off as a show about sweet pies, savory pies, and pizza pies. And then, things just sort of changed, and the people down there said, yeah, no. And they said, what about pies and cakes? And I said, well, I love pies, but I'm not that big a cake fan. I said, what about pies and bakeries? And they said, oh, that's interesting. Let's see what, and that came out. That's what we did. We did a show about a few great pie places and a few great bakeries and a few good pie places.
Well, so the question then from that is, how do you react to notes that you're given? When somebody gives you a note, do you sit back and take it and then think about it? Or do you have a visceral reaction to notes? How do you deal with note giving and note taking?
It probably depends on who it comes from.
Oh,
So yeah, I mean, I think we all,
and nobody likes to be told that what you've presented isn't good or doesn't work or should be totally different. Nobody wants to hear that. Everybody wants to hear you're wonderful, right? So I ask lots of people who create, what happens when they receive notes? What happens for you? Does it change the process?
It just opens other doors, I think. I can think of an example. I mean, we used to do this here. It hasn't happened in a long time, and I don't want to bring it back. But back in the early days here in the late 80s, early 90s at QED, when you finished a project, everyone in the building got to look at it first and criticize it.
Wow.
And I sort of hated that because I said, I don't get to talk about what this person's doing for their job and like how they could do it better. But everyone was given a chance. And I remember, I think probably the first draft of Kennywood Memories, it started with Laughing Sal, who I always liked. I don't know if you know, an early robot animatronic woman, big fat woman who laughs. When I was a kid, she was at Laughing in the Dark. And now I think she's over by the train, although I haven't been to Kennywood yet this year, so she may be somewhere else. Laughing Sal is her name. And I started with that. And then at this pre-release screening, someone said, it's called Kennywood Memories. couldn't you start with some memories as opposed to Laughing Sal? And I thought, oh, yeah, maybe we could. And so we went back and like tried to find some memories that people had, and they were really nice. And now I love that. I mean, I love that that's how it begins, with people talking about Kennywood and their memories.
And that is what I love to hear, because that's what the note process is. And some people instantly knee-jerk react no to any kind of note, but I think it's important that people accept notes. And
Oh,
that's
yeah.
what I'm glad to hear that is something that you're able to do. I also think probably at this point, 37 years at WQED, they probably think you know what you're doing.
I'm not sure.
You haven't earned your stripes yet, Rick?
I don't know.
I am curious about legalities. Do you ever need clearances when you go out into the field?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
How does that work?
We have standard forms, releases, location releases, things that you have to get.
And you don't ever pay people out in the world, do you?
No, we've never paid anybody. I don't think, if they weren't paid, we're not going to do it. That kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. But they require you to get some form of release so that you have the image in their voice and you can actually exploit it then.
Yes, because I mean, there's the rare chance that someone's not going to like the way they look or like what they said and all that kind of stuff. But if you have a release that says, I mean, and I always say that to people when I ask them to sign the release, this says that we've taken your picture, we're going to edit it, and we're not going to pay you. That's my standard, shtick as I hand them a page that's like all legalese.
Do you ever need releases for if you shoot the side of a building and you haven't contacted the owner?
Not if you're in a public place.
If you're on a sidewalk?
Yeah, on a sidewalk on a public street, you don't need to have releases from every building. No.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right, so we touched on editing several times in the show, but I want to talk to you about editing because I think that's really critical. How much time does it typically take to make, let's say, an hour-long program in the edit bay? Is there an average?
I'm going to say, I guess if you want, if I have to respond, I'd say 2 to 3 months.
2 to 3 months for a 1-hour show.
Yeah. Does that sound like a little or a lot?
That sounds like heavy-duty editing to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it surprises me. Editing, because it's become digital and nonlinear and all of that, it goes a little faster than it used to when you had to build things sequentially.
Right.
But like when I look back on Kennywood Memories, we shot that in the summer of 1988, and it like premiered at the end of October, which was really fast turnaround, I think.
Well, there are lots of TV shows today where like 60 Minutes, obviously they spend months and months and months putting a 15-minute segment together. But my guess is the editorial part of it is a lot more condensed. It's the prep, it's the gathering guests, et cetera, et cetera. In your case, you're going out into the field and shooting what you can find that day.
Right.
And so you're coming back with all this material. So I guess it takes you a long time to get through it all to decide what to use.
Right. I mean, like, a one-day shoot, you can probably turn around a lot quicker than an hour-long show. That's what you'd asked about.
Sure. Right. Sure.
I would like to say 2 months, but I don't want to put myself in a box either.
Well, no, if it's 2 to 3 months, I think that's valuable information for the listeners if they have an interest in doing what you do. And so it's part of the answer here is it's not a short-term process. It's not something you knock out in a couple of days.
No, it usually takes a lot more thought. And I mean, I know the cameraman I'm working with right now and have worked for many years with Frank Colliero. He always wants me to go faster. Get through that I build the A-roll. I don't know if you know this terminology. I build the story and the sound bites I want to hear, and I usually add the narration where I think it's necessary. And then I hand it to an editor. I used to do it with Kevin Conrad, who was my editor here for many years. He passed away during the pandemic, but Frank now does that. And I give, Frank has shot with me, so he knows better what's there and what the possibilities are. But he always thinks I take too long to, weasel together the A-roll before he gets to add pictures on top, which is the B-roll.
Is that stock footage?
No, it's stuff that he shot usually.
I see.
It's just that it's not interview. The A-roll is usually interview and me.
Got it.
And then he gets to add all the other pictures. So in the thing we're doing now, he has stuff we shot up at Bottle Rocket around the bar, this, dive bar run by Muppets. It's
This I have to see. It makes me want to go visit this place.
Oh, it's great. It's really great. It's excellent. But I've been going there it was the third anniversary when we were there, the night that we were there, and they've been very nice to me. They usually show some of my shows once or twice a year, and but they have world-class comedians. They have music acts of all sorts, and then they do special events too, like fake prom night and fake wedding and all that kind of stuff, and they get a nice crowd. And so I was happy to celebrate them some as they got to their third anniversary.
Well, that's real, and that's, I assume, part of the joy of what you do is that you get to celebrate people in a much more public way than they ordinarily would get.
Exactly. Yes, and I enjoy that.
So, how important, from your perspective, is the understanding of rhythm and timing in making a cut?
Oh, it changes. Depends on what's being said. And again, I pass it on to Frank, and I know he's going to shorten a lot of things just because we've heard enough. And I usually agree with him.
How important do you think it was that you started early on in the theater and understood performance and understood what it was like to do, to be in the public front, eye, etc., to what you do now? How important do you think all those years ago is still playing out today?
I haven't thought about it, but probably a lot. I mean, I think that's
I would think it is.
yeah. The stuff you learn as a kid, or the stuff that you do when you're in high school, and when you're sort of free to find things you love. I think that has a big influence. So yeah, I think there's probably a lot of that still exists, and
It comes out again. We've talked about this several times, but it comes out in the narration. You have a performance ability.
oh, thank you again. I often wonder how much of it is my parents. My mom, who had this urge, with community theater. She had never studied theater or anything like that. But my dad was a salesman, and I always think that has an influence too. He knew
Interesting.
how to talk to people and be a salesman. He sold industrial pipes, valves, and fittings. And, I think the combination of those two things. My mom was certainly a big reader, and I always appreciate the fact that she would always say, "I don't care what you're reading, as long as you're reading."
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I wish a lot more adults had that attitude. I don't
Mm-hmm.
care what you're reading, as long as you're reading.
I agree. I
And
I agree. Well, and obviously you've read widely.
except that, I don't know, phones make it harder. you know, I I spend a lot more time on my phone than I think I used to spend reading more.
Why do you say harder?
I wish I read more than I do now, more like I used to.
Well, how many books would you read at a time? 3 or 4 at a time back in the day?
I think I have 3 going right now, in my bedroom.
And I would say that that's not common. That's fairly uncommon. People might read several books a year.
Huh. Well, I mean, and I'm not reading them fast, obviously, because they're all still, midway. But, I'm also a bit of a hoarder, and I have too many books. And, it's just,
I would say, Rick, take a number and get in line. I have too many books too. Well, I've been having so much fun. This is one of my favorite interviews with the great Rick Sebak, who has been, for almost 4 decades at WQED, making some of the most marvelous documentaries in the world. And we're going to wind the show down a little bit now. And I'm wondering, in all of your many travels and experiences, are you able to share with us a story more than the many that you've already told us, that's either weird, quirky, offbeat, strange, or just plain funny?
well, it's hard. I thought about when I came to Pittsburgh in 1987 from South Carolina. One of the other producers in South Carolina, Tim Carrier, had just done a documentary about 3 Frank Lloyd Wright houses in South Carolina. When I said, "Hey, I'm going to take a new job in Pittsburgh," and he goes, "Oh, let me know when you get settled because I want to see Falling Water." And the cameraman that he had worked with, Herman Rich, said, "I want to come too. I want to see Falling Water." And so I said, "Great." And so I was here a month or two. I was living at my parents' house, and they came up, and Tim had contacted Falling Water, and they said, "Oh yes," and he sent his documentary, I guess, on a VHS, and they said, "We'd love to have you. Please come." We went, and there was like no one else there. It was not quite as set up for tourism as it is right now. Back in 1987, and we had this great day. Showed us all around. Got to go places where you don't get to go when you're on the tour and all that. And then at the end of the day, they said, "Is there anything you haven't seen that you would like to see?" And Tim said, "I would like to see it at dusk and maybe as the lights come on at night." And they said, "Oh, no problem. Here are the keys."
Oh.
And we were all like, "What?" And they said, "When you go out, just put them in the mailbox at the end of the driveway."
Oh, wow.
And I just thought like, oh, things are going to work out great here. So I always remember that as being like a moment of good luck. And sometimes people ask me, do you have an interview that you remember as being really wonderful? And that always, it was with Wendy King. I don't know if you ever listened to Party Line on KDKA. It was a radio show. My grandmother and my mother were both, frequent listeners. Party Line, I think it was on KDKA every night for like 30 years. And you never heard the callers. It was a call-in show, but you never heard the callers. They would just, Ed and Wendy King, and usually a third person who changed over the years would help. And, they would say, "Oh, we have a caller on the line who, one time they said, who wants to know the bird with the largest wingspan." They talked about anything. It was a party line. And I mentioned that because I heard that one night when my mom was listening, and I said, "Mom, we had that today in school. I know what bird has the largest wingspan, the South American condor." And she said, "Call." And I thought, I'll never get through. And she said, "Just call, try." And I got through right away. And I said, I know which bird has the largest wingspan. And Wendy said, "There's a young man on the line who says he knows and so she just sort of repeated what I said, South American condor. I was very proud that I got through, and it was really wonderful. When I came back to Pittsburgh, it had gone off the air in 1970 when Ed King passed away. But Wendy was still here, and I don't know, I'd heard that she was in Green Tree or something like that, and I thought, oh, I'd love to talk to her. And so I called her and I said, could we talk about, I had done things that aren't there anymore, and I wanted to do another follow-up show called Stuff That's Gone. And she said, "I don't really want to talk about it." But we liked each other. It was obvious on the phone, and we kept talking. And I would call her occasionally and say, "Have you reconsidered? Would you let me come talk to you?" And everything. She, "I don't think so. No, the Ed's gone," and blah blah blah. And then one day she called me and she said, "I've thought about it. I would like to do this if you would consider interviewing me in my attic." And I thought, like, "Whoa, that is spectacular," because that's where all the boxes of stuff from Party Line are stored.
Wow.
She said we could just sit up there with those boxes. And I said, absolutely perfect. And in order to get to the attic, you had to go through her closet in her bedroom. It was just, you felt like you were really, getting to do something special. And I remember that as just being phenomenal. But I think there's just the exposure and, the joy of making friends that sometimes last, I think is one of the things that just I find fascinating and funny, and you don't know, and it's just so many different things. I mean, but I'm also blessed with the fact that there are weird things in Pittsburgh that I get to show to other people. I mean, someone said, like, where do you want to take people to come to town? Well, yeah, I do like to take them to the Strip, but I really love to take them to see the Moxovanka murals in the church in Millvale, or St. Anthony's Chapel up on Troy Hill. Two places that I learned about when I did Holy Pittsburgh still fascinate me. That lets you know, yes, about the immigrant communities that were here, and sort of maybe the lack of attention that the diocese was paying to some of these smaller churches. So it's constant. I can't put any superlatives as to the best or all of that kind of stuff, but I do like that. And, another thing that I've always loved is, because Kennywood Memories is, I say when I die, I think the newspaper will say, "Man who made Kennywood Memories dies."
Probably right.
because it's the most popular of the local shows. Kennywood Memories, 1988. But I love to meet people from the show. Sometimes people say, like, I'm in Kennywood Memories. And I'll say, like, what? Where? Why? How do you, if it's not someone that I remember. And I've had several things like that. My friend Kathy Niederberger, I had known her, I think, for like maybe 5 to 10 years before she said, I'm in Kennywood Memories. And I said, no. And she said, at one of the places where there were games being played towards the end of the show, she's standing with a girlfriend who goes, "Big I love you, bear." She doesn't say it. The girlfriend says it, but Kathy's standing right beside her there. I remember one time going into the Oyster House downtown, and there's a little side door. I don't even know. It's too long since I've been there whether the side door still works, but I'm going in the side door, and there's a guy going in front of me, a young guy, and he goes, "Yeah, Mr. Sebak, you know what? I'm in Kennywood Memories." I said, "Oh, really? Yeah?" He said, "Yeah, I'm in Harold's horrendously horrible haunted hideaway, which we now call the Old Mill, which was always called the Old Mill." And I said, "Yeah?" And he goes, "I'm one of the canoodlers." And that it was a word I wanted to use, canoodle, which sort of means to make out. People sometimes canoodle in the Old Mill in those boats. And he said, "You asked me if I would put my arm," we were sitting behind him with a camera. And I said, "Would you put your arm around, your girlfriend?" And he goes, "Sure." He said, "It was our first date."
Oh,
I said, like, "Wow." I said, "And now you're married?" He goes, "No, it was our only date." So I love stuff like that.
You got him to canoodle on the first date.
First date. And I mean, he just put his arm around her, but he thought it was a good idea, but it didn't work out.
Well, you are clearly not going to run out of ideas for Pittsburgh. That's for sure. There's lots of places still to come. So last question for you today, Rick. You've shared with us an enormous amount of very valuable information and advice throughout this show. But do you have a single solid piece of advice or a tip that you like to give to those who are starting out in the business, or maybe they're in a little bit trying to get to the next level?
Yeah, I do. I have a standard bit of advice, which is read constantly and write just as constantly. And I just think that, even though it is a visual video world, all that stuff is still so important. And I know that when I came here, the woman who hired me, Nancy Lavin, when I started, the day I started, I was given an office, and there were 250 tapes in there that had been submitted for the job. And I said, like, "How do you do that? How do you go through 250? And she goes, "Well, the thing is," she goes, "the first thing is we look at the cover letter. If there is a grammatical error in the cover letter, we don't go any further." And I just think people should know that, it does matter. It does matter that you have a subject and a predicate that match, and that, there aren't any grammatical errors in your cover letter. And, I just think that all of those things are important. And as I said, and also just maintaining your energy level enough to get the responses to come back to you with the same intensity that you're putting them out. So, that's what I tell, if students want to know a little bit about, I would say read, write, and learn to ask questions.
And get it right in your query letters and in what you're writing. I'm so glad that you said that, because for years I have taught screenwriting students that the readers in Hollywood will read to the first mistake, and then they'll ask, if this writer couldn't care enough to get it right, why should I care enough to continue reading? And so it's very important that people who are trying to get into the business make their work as perfect as possible.
Right. I think you're absolutely right. And, it's good advice.
Rick Sebak, this has been a great joy and a lot of fun for me. And I can't thank you enough for your time, your energy, and especially for your wisdom and for giving us all these great documentaries for all these years. Thank you so much for doing the show.
All the thanks comes to you, because, this has been a joy, and, it's, and you're a great interviewer.
Well, now I'm blushing. Thank you very much. And I hope you continue with great success.
You too.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.